Hello, and welcome to Week 3, Unit 2 of Application Development for SAP Business by Design. In this unit, we'll be looking at an overview of the UI Designer. Now, the UI Designer is an in-house built graphical tool for designing floor plans. Floor plans are the actual screens. We refer to them as in design time as floor plans. And in the UI Designer, we can go in there and maintain and fine-tune either our custom floor plans or even standard floor plans. We have a way to be able to see what all those standard ones are, and we'll come to that in a later bit. With this, the UI Designer itself is actually installed by default when you install the Studio. So there's nothing separate that you need to install. We can launch it from the Studio itself, and you'll see it's actually really nice. It provides drag and drop capabilities. There's a lot of very easy ways to edit properties of different things in the UI, so it's a really good tool. Now, a quick high level about it. The layout itself, it has very similar to this. We put in some slides just to give you an easy reference of what the layout is. The main part you'll see is the Designer tab at the bottom left. This is the actual design time view of the floor plan that's there, where we'll actually do a lot of our work in this screen. You can see how the layout is and be able to modify the layout itself. The Data Model tab is where it stores the actual data model of the floor plan and how it ties the elements of the floor plan itself to a business object. And we'll talk about the data model when we get to that tab and how it actually works. The Controller tab stores all of the events and actions, queries, what are imports and outports. And then the last tab is the Preview tab. And the Preview tab will allow us to preview the floor plan from this place specifically, just the UI Designer, but just for that screen. I always recommend previewing from the Studio itself, and I'll show you how to do that when we get to the Preview tab. The other side is where we typically see things like the Toolbox, which has new empty elements that we can bring in, so an empty table, a field, something like that. Also the Properties section, so we can adjust the properties of a particular UI element. The Configuration Explorer is where it's a big folder structure. We can see the content of our solution as well as all the standard content. It's a really great tab to give us lots of good info about what all the screens are that are in the solution and how to work with them. And then the last one, or actually the BO browser and data model, is where we can also see some info about what the data model is, and provides a quick way to reference the data model if, let's say, you're in the Designer tab or even the Controller tab. And then the last one to point out is the Extensibility Explorer. And in Extensibility, we're going to use this very heavily, and that's how we'll actually be able to modify standard floor plans. And then we pointed out a few things about the toolbar itself. Where the save and activate, obviously you need to make sure you save and activate everything. The display edit, so as we open floor plans, they need to be in edit mode for us to make changes. Otherwise they're in display mode to view. We'll talk about what the flex layout is and how to add and remove columns. And then of course the run is also available there for previewing from the UI Designer as well. Now, as I said, these are just high-level slides. Just so that we have an easy reference, let's actually go ahead and get into the Studio and open the UI Designer so we can see it in a little bit more detail. Now, there's a couple ways you can open the UI Designer. You can either go to Administration and say Open UI Designer from here, or you could double-click on one of your floor plans, and from there you'd be able to open it up. So I'm going to go ahead and open one of mine. You'll see this window shows up. It says it's loading. At that point in time, you'll just have to wait it out. If you try to open another floor plan during that time, it's going to give you a little box that says it's loading, please wait. But after it's done, we'll see a screen like this. And this is our actual UI Designer. It opens up, I can see my floor plan. If I had another floor plan open maybe, or if this opened it, it would be in display mode with this little lock icon, and that's how I can know if I'm in display or edit mode. If I want to toggle between the two, I can just use this little pencil icon button, and that will put me back into edit mode in this case. But again, we see all these tabs that we just briefly mentioned. So here we are in the Designer tab. This is what the owl for our bonus plan looks like at design time. You can notice it's a little bit different looking than what we actually see at runtime with the business user, but it's still the same layout itself. No difference, just the theming behind it is different here. So I can see that I have a table, that there's different columns, the labels are up there, what kind of buttons are here. And as I select something, for example, let's say bonus plan, you can see I get a little red box around it that shows whether the focus is of what I'm currently viewing or planning to edit within the UI Designer. And as I change this, you'll notice the properties on the right hand side here also change to adjust to what is currently being selected. So for example, in a button, we'll have a different look, a different set of properties than a column in my table will. Now each of these are adjusted by, for example, if I select the button here, the edit button, you can see that the display type is button. I can see also that, for example, it has an on-click event, and we'll get to what the events are a little bit later. Also, I can see, if I go back to the edit button here and scroll down, I can see that there is some text behind it, right? So what's the actual text of the button? In this case, it's edit. And anything I need to see about it, I can adjust. Let's go to the column. Here you can see this is marked as an input field right now, but although I will mention any owl that we have, so the initial owl in a Work Center view, no matter if you have this as an input field or not, will always be read-only. So all owls, if you notice, are always read-only. If I go into a list view within one of my other floor plans, then those will actually be editable. So even though I have this as an input field, it will be read-only since it is my owl within my Work Center view. But still I can see what it is. If I had a field that I wanted to, let's say, change if it was enabled or not, I could do that. If it's visible or not, I have a property for that, so column visible. And notice here this is true, false, advanced. I can adjust this and say true or false by default, or I can say advanced and then I have a couple options of what I want to do. I could bind this to a flag, so let's say our isConsistent flag, to say that I only want this to show if a value to show if something is consistent. Also, I can put a calculation rule, which is basically some Ruby scripting that we can use in the front end to also provide some dynamic behavior to our UI. So I can take different elements from my data model to be able to read some data and react on that and change the properties there. One thing about the calculation rules in Ruby scripting is that they're not supported on tablet devices or mobile devices. They can't be rendered, and so I would say I usually try to refrain from using this if I can. There's other ways you can usually achieve the same thing by using some events and some flags, but it's at least there and gives you the option in case you don't mind having those limitations. Also, you can see here below I have a couple pane containers, they call them, and there's a few different ones. Let's say if I go ahead and let's insert a flex layout row, you can see it actually added a new set of empty boxes here. All of our floor plans are laid out in some type of grid of rows and columns. You can combine them so they should be together into one, which is actually what our table is in, is one giant combined row. You can also unsplit them and be able to combine them in columns if you need to. And so this is how we can start to adjust even more how our actual layout is. So in our QAF, for example, or OIF, if we want to have a set of fields, three fields side by side, three different columns of fields, I would need 3 columns in my flex layout to allow that to happen. So this is most of what the Designer tab, we're going to spend a lot of time in this tab and what it does. I could also use the toolbox here to be able to drag in, let's say, some different fields and maybe another table if I need to, and I would need to take care of populating those accordingly. Now let's go ahead and look at the data model, and before we go there, let's look at our bonus plan column here, our bonus plan ID. Notice the data information has a value here, and in there it says bonus plan ID, and then it gives us some long URL and then root tilde bonus plan ID. This is the actual binding. So this itself is just a UI element. It's just a column on a table, an empty field. It doesn't know what its purpose is. And the data binding and the data model is what's going to actually give it purpose. So let's keep that in mind, the value that's there, and let's look at the data model. And I can see the model of my floor plan on the left-hand side. This is the actual model, data model or structure of my floor plan. In our case, it's a list view here. There's always some kind of root for the data model. Ours has this list called data list, and it has a number of columns under it. Now your data model may represent exactly what a business object looks like, but not directly. It could be different. It could actually hold data from multiple business objects. But for mine, you can see that I have this selected. And on the right-hand side, I can see my business object, bonus plan. And the bonus plan at the top is also bound. And notice if I change to bonus plan ID, for example, that the highlighted part on the right also changes to the highlighted of bonus plan ID there. And so the green part here actually shows what's bound, and we're binding these elements in our data model to elements and nodes of a business object. And this is going to basically tell the framework, hey, pull in data from these places in the business object into these places of our data model. From then, the design, and if we go back to the designer tab, our UI elements, so for example our bonus plan ID, will be bound to the different places in our data model. So bonus plan ID was bound to bonus plan ID itself, whereas if I select my table, you can see this is bound to root data list, right? So this is where it's actually showing the binding of the actual element to our data model to a business object. And this is how we get data to interact between the three and be able to show data in the UI and be able to write data back. In the data model, it can be bound or unbound. We need it to be bound to have data actually happening. And now all this was provided to us since we generated our screen, and it knew what the kind of fields were on our object and took the set of kind of a preset amount number to generate the actual owl here. The blue ones we can ignore. These are system ones. You may use some of these in some of your scripting. For now, we'll leave them be. But the green ones mean it's actually bound. So right, we see that this is bound. Bonus plan ID is bound, it's green. If I said unbind, this would now become yellow. And let me go back here. Notice how I select bonus plan ID and it doesn't show me bonus plan ID over here as being highlighted. It's unbound, it's yellow, it has no value to it. I could still run it in the UI, but any data I put in there is just orphaned within the floor plan itself. It's not actually going to a business object or anything else. I may have a use case for that if I want to utilize that in some action, but in this case I actually want to show the bonus plan ID of all the instances. And so I'm going to go ahead and bind this again just by selecting the two and then hitting bind. So that's our data model, and you can see this also has a set of properties. For example, if I click on the root, you can see on initialize. So as soon as the screen is initialized, if I want to perform some kind of event, I can do that. I can also adjust and give some default values within the UI itself, not so much on my object, but in the floor plan itself, if something should be defaulted and the initial value. Now the next part let's look at is our controller tab. Now if you remember, I said this has the event handlers, the queries, import, output. Let's look at the event handlers real quick. And that edit button was bound to this event handler itself, the name event handler, or edit handler, sorry. These are the events within the floor plan itself, not within our business object, although we'll reuse those events and actions. But this is floor plan events, UI events themselves. So here we have an edit handler, which says fire this output to bonus plan edit. There's a create one as well. We have this another event handler that says execute this default set. Our queries, we can have a number of queries in here as well. And these queries have what are called default sets, and that's what this event handler is doing. We basically say call this default set, which is going to trigger this query. And now we actually use the query of our bonus plan, this query by elements, to populate the list in our owl. And every object, every node that we create by default has a query by elements. We talked about that in an earlier unit. So I didn't have to create a new query here. I just reused the same one. And you see that it stores the result in that root data list of our data model. So this would then fire the query and store it within the correct result list. Also in here are, let's talk about imports and outports. So imports are basically how you can navigate to a particular screen, how to actually come in there and maybe pass some data to it. An outport is how you would leave that screen to go to some other screen. So we define import so that anybody can navigate to that screen. The outports itself, we have to specifically say where we want to navigate to. So I'm going to open up this Obian navigation and let's look at the edit case. Excuse me. This is saying for our bonus plan object, call this operation to bonus plan edit, and keep that in mind. Remember that text there. And then this is actually also using the same output to bonus plan edit. So here it's again to bonus plan edit. We actually have a parameter in this case, right? Because when we're going to edit an object, we need to know what the ID is, the specific one, and so we're passing that ID in. Now, if I go to this Configuration Explorer tab, remember this was where it shows us all of the floor plans of the standard solution as well as our solution, and we have that down here at the bottom. It shows our technical ID of our solution. If I open the source folder, let's open up my QAF. And let's go to the controller tab here, and let's look at the imports here. You'll notice OBN edit import that this has this operation 2 bonus plan edit. This is where we see in our outputs when we're selecting where we want to go to the name that we're seeing. We're basically saying navigate to this import, and our PTP file knows where this import is, what it's called, and how to get there. And also you can see that it expects that in parameter 0 some type of ID. So this is what this output is calling here. It's calling that same import, the edit import of our QAF. It's using that parameter 0 to give in the ID of whatever we've selected to edit. And this is how when we select something in our OWL and say edit, that it actually navigates to that particular edit screen in our QAF. It loads the instance. And then of course the preview itself here. Now I said you can preview from here, and you certainly can. There's nothing to stop you. I personally like to recommend coming back to your studio and right click on your OWL, for example, and say preview screen from here. This is going to load the screen, and the benefit of doing it here is that you can actually easily navigate to other screens to test a whole scenario as well, whereas in the UI Designer you're usually testing just that one screen. So I always like to come here, click on my OWL, and begin my testing from here if I need to, or assign it to a user and test through the front end. But I can at least test my screens from here if I'm doing some additional development, I want to play with it. And then the other thing I want to show you here is if we go back here, we also have properties on all of these different items. And if I open this, if I look at this edit, you can see this has an on fire event as well. That means whenever this import is called, it says call this event edit handler. And this edit handler is again another event that is actually going to go ahead and read the instance of that business object, and it loads it into this floor plans data model. So this is how, when we click that button, we saw how it can navigate from the output to the import. This is how the import actually says load this particular instance of this business object. We create this edit handler event, and then we bind that to the on fire of the import itself. So this is the UI Designer. You can see there's a lot to it. It's definitely a very comprehensive tool, but it's still very useful, very beneficial. It's a great tool once you see and get used to all the familiar with the functions that are in there. So that ends this unit itself. In the next unit, we'll actually go into fine-tuning our UIs and making it a little bit cleaner for our business users. Thank you.